This is Novel Film. We read the book, watch the adaptation, and only discuss once we hit record.
So today we'll be talking about Shrek, which is a sort of forgotten children's book. I think most people obviously will recognize that it is a movie, but it's actually based on a children's book from the 1990s, written and illustrated by William Steig, published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, which is an imprint of Macmillan Publishers, and I do think that it is published through a number of imprints at this point. It won a couple of awards in 1990. It won Best Picture Book from the Parents' Choice Awards and several Cuffies from Publishers Weekly, namely Funniest Book of the Year and Best Opening Line.
Perfect.
I would evaluate that the target audience for this children's book is about 4 to 10 years old. I think that it's actually sort of quite universal. There's not that much text on each page, but it's very funny and gripping, and the images are quite endearing. And I think that there's a pretty large range of children who would find it entertaining. I don't think kids younger than 4 will be able to understand what's in it. I think that's a little too conceptual. And I think children older than 10 would probably find it kind of childish. It is kind of a subversion of your standard fairy tale. It follows the eponymous Shrek, having been booted out by his parents into the world to find his way. He, as you might recognize from the movie, meets a talking donkey, fights a dragon, fights a knight, and in the end gets the princess. Where it probably diverges drastically from the movie is that, first of all, I would say the core theme of this book is ugliness. In that Shrek is proud to be ugly, loves his ugliness, but also that the princess is ugly from the start. She is hideous. She is ugly. And that is a point of pride for both of these characters, and it's actually what they love about one another in Wedding Vows from Hell.
And can I ask, is there any sort of involvement? Does Shrek go through any kind of process?
Yeah, actually, surprisingly, despite the book's short 32-page length, Shrek is confronted with his own ugliness and his effect on other people, and does sort of, at first, I think, especially again where it really is different from the movie, Shrek isn't upset about being ugly. Shrek is proud, but he's never seen himself. And there is a moment where he is confronted with his own reflection in a room of mirrors. And it's the first time he ever experiences fear. And you see him kind of go like, oh. And then about 10 seconds later, he's like, don't. And decides that he's so awesomely proud of his ugliness.
Yeah. The reason I ask is because I was really not sure. Because I think that's a moment where you as a reader would expect, oh, now Shrek is going to change his ways because he's confronted. It's a very classic setup to this is where the hero changes. Yeah. He's confronted with himself. But as you say, 10 seconds later, he's like, oh, it's me.
Amazing.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's something that's really interesting because again, despite only being 32 pages long, every page basically every page turns some kind of fairy tale trope on its head.
Yeah.
You would assume that you'd be following the knight. You wouldn't assume that you'd be following what is basically an antagonist. It's a mix of it's not that deep. It is a 32-page children's book, but also it is kind of a fun romp, and it is trying to kind of subvert your expectations, both as a parent, but probably at this point also as a child. I do think that the book expects its reader to have come into contact with a certain amount of tropes and with a certain amount of fairy tales. I do think it expects its reader to have preformed expectations that it is actively trying to confront. And I also think that's where a lot of the humor comes from, because it is constantly making fun of the exact thing that you would expect to happen. And so, in a lot of ways, it's not a traditional story. It's not asking its characters to change. No. It's sort of confirming that the characters were right to begin with, which is, I think maybe in some people's eyes, an enormous writing fail. But I think that's probably where a lot of the charm comes from. And I do think that it's a really incredibly charming book, and that it's quite sweet despite how odd it is. I quickly want to read to you The Wedding Vows from Hell.
Oh, excellent.
Because I do think that sums it all up better than I could. Perfect. So Shrek meets his ugly, ugly princess, and they instantly fall in love. And the first thing he says to her is, "Oh, ghastly you, with lips of blue, your ruddy eyes with carmine styes, enchant me. I could go on, I know you know, the reason why I love you so. You're ugly." And the princess goes, "Your nose is so hairy, oh, let us not tarry. Your look is so scary, I think we should marry." To which they immediately embrace each other and get married by a crocodile.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really charming, subversive children's book that plays a lot on fairy tale and nursery rhyme standards.
I think you're completely right. And especially the subversion of fairy tale, I think, is what we're going to probably talk a lot about.
Yeah.
Because that's definitely a theme that also carries into the adaptation of it. And it's a really good point that the audience must have come in contact with a certain level of fairy tale tropes.
Something that I do find sort of fun, because obviously my ripe age of 28, I have seen the movie a lot, and I did read Shrek as a child, which is how I know it was a book. And it was a beloved book of mine. But upon rereading it, Shrek is not an ogre.
Oh.
And at no point is he referred to as an ogre.
Wait, really?
Yeah, he's not an ogre.
Oh, that's some Mandela syndrome.
Right, he's not an ogre. And it's interesting because, like, his character design is identical. Like, they just pulled the character design straight from the book, and that's fine. It's a really good character design. Bizarre ears. But he's not an ogre. He's never, like, whatever Shrek is never mentioned.
So this begs the question, is Shrek even his name? Or is it his title?
It definitely is his name. Another thing that I've seen claimed a lot on the internet with dubious sourcing is that Shrek, the title, and also Shrek, the name, is based on the German/Yiddish word Schreck, which means scream. And actually the Danish word skri is pretty much the same word. And maybe I haven't seen anything that's particularly convincing one way or the other. It does fit the theme. People do scream when they see him, but I haven't seen anything particularly conclusive that says that is his title.
No.
Let me see. What is Shrek described as?
Because there's a lot of descriptions of being hideous and...
Yes, this is definitely the focus of the text, is that Shrek is ugly.
Yeah.
He's described as, his mother was ugly and his father was ugly, but Shrek was uglier than the two of them put together. By the time he toddled, Shrek could spit flame a full 99 yards and emit smoke from either ear. With just a look, he cowed the reptiles in the swamp. Any snake dumb enough to bite him instantly got convulsions and died. And then then the story starts. At no point is he referred to as anything specific. He is Shrek.
He's just a menace to society.
Yeah, he's just a menace. With really weird ears.
That's excellent. I wanted to ask, did you read the book as a kid before watching the movie? Because it came out when we were kind of like a little bit old enough to maybe have read some children's books.
I'm pretty sure I read the book before the movie.
Yeah.
We found it in the children's library in the English section, which is limited in Denmark for obvious reasons. And it was a favorite of mine. My mom and I read it a lot.
I think what's cool about it is, it's a kid's story, but like you say, children do have some understanding of this is what good is in a fairy tale, this is what evil is. Like they've internalized all of these tropes quite quickly. Yeah,
we create expectations from them very clearly, like from day one. Like by the time they're 2, they are already displaying expectations of narrative. And they're already playing out narratives that they've already seen. So by the time they would come into contact with Shrek, they have definitely formed an idea of what a fairy tale is and what happens in what order. And Shrek does follow the standard order. He gets kicked out of his his black hole in the book. He gets kicked out of a black hole, and he ventures into the world, and he meets a witch. And the witch gives him a premonition, foretells his future, and he follows that future to the T. He sets out to do what the witch told him. He meets a talking donkey. He belches on a dragon. He punches a knight, and then he marries a princess. I think most of the subversion comes from who is doing what and why they're doing it.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it is pretty, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. Yeah, again, it's 32 pages.
It's 32 pages.
Not
Honestly,
more to talk
that's
about.
fine, because when you brought up Shrek as a first episode for this podcast, I thought, great, it'll be quick and simple and easy. But as I was looking into the production, the adaptation of this, it is anything but simple.
Ogres are like onions.
They stink?
Yes. No.
Oh, they make you cry?
No.
Oh, you leave them out in the sun, they get all brown, start sprouting little white hairs.
No. Layers. Onions have layers. Ogres have layers. Onions have layers. You get it. We both have layers.
Honestly, there is so much drama surrounding this production, and I'm not going to go into most of it. I will quickly do a recap because some of these things come up. So, a very brief Disney/DreamWorks drama recap, as some of this drama is relevant to the movie. Mm-hmm. Jeffrey Katzenberg used to be head of animation at Disney, but was fired by then CEO Michael Eisner. In 1994, Katzenberg founded DreamWorks with Steven Spielberg and David Geffen. Katzenberg and Eisner have had a very well-documented and public resentment towards another. Mm-hmm. And it is more than obvious in Shrek, both as a fairy tale subversion, but also it directly responds to tropes in Disney, which we will talk more about. So, now that we're all caught up, Shrek is a 90-minute movie, significantly longer than the 30-page children's book. It was released in 2001, produced by Jeffrey Katzenberg, John H. Williams, and Aaron Warner. The writing credits include Ted Elliott, Terry Rossio, Joe Stillman, and Roger S. H. Shulman, and we'll get back to why there are so many credits. The directors are Andrew Adamson and Vicky Jensen. Spielberg first obtained the rights to Shrek in 1991, so very briefly after...
Virtually
immediately after it was published. But then it just didn't get produced. And it wasn't until 94 when John H. Stillman, who was a producer at DreamWorks, his children were reading it, and he was thoroughly entertained. Like we talked about, it was just great.
It's a fun romp.
It's a fun romp for children and parents alike. He realized, Steven has the rights. Great. Bring them to DreamWorks. And shortly after, Katzenberg bought the rights off of Spielberg and started production in 94. The budget for Shrek was $60 million. Can you guess what the worldwide box office for the Shrek movie was?
I'm sort of terrified about how much money Shrek has made, because Shrek Again was like a whole thing. I can't guess. I can't just tell.
No, it's exactly. It's $484.4 million at the worldwide box office. Jeez. It has won the first ever Academy Award for Best Animated Feature. Mm-hmm. It was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay. Mm. It was nominated for 6 BAFTAs, including the BAFTA for Best Adapted Screenplay. In 2010, Shrek was awarded his own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame.
That's so hilarious. Very weird.
If you wish to give yourself nightmares, I recommend Googling this ceremony. There is a person in a giant Shrek costume, and it is horrifying.
That's really upsetting.
It's hideous! Oh, that's not very nice.
It's really upsetting. And in 2020, I need to say this with a straight face.
Don't even try.
In 2020, Shrek was the first ever non-Disney animated film to be selected for preservation in the National Film Registry. Do you know what the National Film Registry is?
No, explain.
So, this is a quote from them. The National Film Registry is a list of movies deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. They are earmarked for preservation by the Library of Congress. So they're not selected as the best American films of all time, but rather as works of enduring importance to American culture.
That is undeniable.
Should we talk about the green ketchup?
I don't really want to talk about the green ketchup. Interestingly enough, I wasn't in America for Shrek Again. It's just that all of my friends were clearly traumatized and then re-traumatized by the Minions movie.
By the excessive ad campaigns for this movie.
The really intense marketing that, yes, included green ketchup.
I think that's probably one of the main reasons why Shrek is such a meme.
Yeah.
lord.
It's the whole... It's a really weird movie.
It's a weird movie. Okay, moving on quickly. The audience. So the book is a children's book, and the film is rated PG. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's a kids' movie. But there was some disagreement as to what this audience should be, which might be very apparent.
You can tell. Interestingly enough, the children's book Shrek, exclamation mark, by the way, Shrek, does actually have some controversy in that some critics felt that it was not appropriate for children. And I find that really interesting because upon rewatching the movie, I did end up thinking to myself, is this appropriate for children? Answer inconclusive.
Inconclusive. Well, honestly, I think that's probably a result of the director, Andrew Adamson, the first director before Jensen came along. He wanted Shrek to lean more towards an adult audience with significantly more sex jokes and a Guns N' Roses soundtrack.
What?
A Guns N' Roses soundtrack.
Why?
I don't know.
Okay.
They have not elaborated.
Please elaborate.
But Katzenberg, which I think this was a good creative choice, he pushed for this to be more aimed towards kids. Mm-hmm. But I feel like there are elements in Shrek where you can see this as interesting. But what I thought, there was a quote from the director that I also really want to read quick, which I think sums up also why maybe it has that tonal issue. Mm-hmm. But personally, I think it works.
Yeah.
And the director was quoted saying, "We really did make the movie for ourselves and made it accessible for children rather than making a movie for children that was accessible to adults." So I think that's a really interesting distinguishment because there are certainly a lot of movies with adult jokes, kids' movies with adult jokes, where the jokes go over the kids' heads and it's like... you can feel that it's planted. Mm-hmm. Yeah. A quick synopsis of the movie is... So, Shrek the movie, like the book, is about Shrek, who lives in a swamp.
Shrek in a swamp.
Shrek, an ogre who lives in a swamp.
Get over it.
You have to stop before I can stop. Okay. So I was good.
Yeah, the moment I looked at you, I heard swamp.
Oh, dear God. Okay. We got this. Shrek is an ogre who lives in a swamp and is happy to be left alone, scaring off villagers that want him dead and never inviting anyone into his life. But the outside world closes in on his life as fairy tale creatures are being evicted and hunted by the rule of a Lord Farquaad. Shrek's swamp is soon flooded with fairy tale creatures who are on the run, and he has no choice but to leave the swamp on a quest to get it back. He is reluctantly joined by an annoying talking donkey who, unlike everyone else, is not scared of Shrek. Lord Farquaad wants to become king, but needs to marry a princess to do so, and the two strike a deal. Shrek will rescue Fiona, a princess locked away in a tower guarded by a fire-breathing dragon, so that Farquaad can marry her, and in exchange, Shrek will get his swamp back. Shrek and Donkey successfully save Fiona from the dragon. Although they start out on shaky ground, Shrek and Fiona quickly learn that they have more in common than originally thought, and develop feelings for one another. But Fiona is hiding a secret. At night, she becomes an ogre, and she needs to kiss her one true love to break the curse. In the final act of the movie, in true rom-com fashion, Shrek objects to the wedding between Fiona and Farquaad and warns Fiona not to marry Farquaad because he's only doing it for the title. As the sun sets, Fiona takes the form of an ogre. Shrek tells Fiona that he loves her, finally letting somebody else in. They get married and Shrek no longer lives his life in solitude. Upon re-watching Shrek, it is such a good movie. I got so excited.
Yeah.
I was like, this is an excellent film. Mm-hmm. It's well executed. And the story is very tightly, knit. And it's truly hilarious. And this should not really have happened because the production of it was a freaking nightmare. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, the film carries on from the book in subverting fairy tales, and it takes this theme and kind of applies it really well to film fairy tales, which, especially in the 90s, but still very much dominated by Disney. So that's what I thought was really interesting. But yeah, tell me, what did you think upon rewatching it?
I think, interesting enough, I actually found it really boring. And I can't tell if that's because I've seen Shrek just, countless times, or if it's because it's actually a boring movie. I think something that jumped out at me at first was the age difference between Shrek in the children's book and Shrek in the movie. Shrek in the children's book gets kicked out by his parents, so presumably he's early 20s. Where Shrek in the movie kind of seems like a 35-year-old man who just has his life figured out. And he likes it the way it is. Whereas, again, Shrek in the book is out on a classic journey to find himself and find his self-acceptance. And his self-acceptance, it ends up being what it started out being. I'm ugly and I love it. With the added of, you're ugly and I love you. Yeah. So they kind of, there's just so many sort of odd choices. And I think when I imagine what that children's book would have been made into, I actually, the first thing that hits me is that I would have made one of those straight to DVD, children's VHS tapes where it's just kind of the exact same thing, but being narrated. And it's hard to imagine how we go from Shrek the children's book to Shrek the blockbuster.
Well, let me give you a brief summation of how that happened. So the production of Shrek is a rabbit hole that I barely escaped. If you're bored one day, it's a whole, you can spend hours just diving into Game of Thrones level, just power struggles. And the production of it has been through so many different stories. And originally there was a version where Shrek was a teenager, and he was like an angsty teenager. And there was also a version where he had flashbacks to his parents trying to eat him.
Which they don't in the book.
No.
They lovingly kick him out of their black hole.
Completely. There was also a version where Shrek's parents were really protective of him and told him he's great. And then he came out into the world and realized, oh, no one else thinks this. Which I thought would have been an interesting take. And it kind of comes back to what I think works about Shrek the movie, which in adapting this book to a 90-minute movie, it would have been unavoidable, I think, to have an emotional core that was deeper than, oh, I'm horrible and I like it, I'm not going to change. And I do really like what they landed on, with it being Shrek pushing the world away because it keeps judging him. And every turning point in the film kind of relates to Shrek's internal self-worth and how he pushes people away. You get to the midpoint of the film and him and Donkey are talking, looking at stars, and here it becomes clear that Shrek has not changed his mind at all after this quest with Donkey and rescuing Fiona. He is now doubling down on his original keep off my lawn, get out my swamp. Get out of my swamp, and is like, I'm going to build a wall around my swamp. No one is being let in, which hurts Donkey's feelings. So that's the midpoint, right? Like, he's not in touch with his need at all, which is very clearly to let other people in. And at the end, the third act, Shrek's sort of first task is to stop the wedding to warn Fiona. But really what he needs to do is to tell her that he loves her. And that's what he ends up doing, like at the final moment of the third act. So yeah, it's all the whole emotional core of the film. I really, really like about pushing people away and building walls around yourself and learning to let people in.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I was struck by was actually how good the onion allegory is.
I love the onion allegory.
Because onions are yummy, and they are layered, but they are also, they smell really intensely, and they make you cry. And I think that we could all probably recognize people like Shrek who are very hurt, and to protect themselves, hurt those around them, and push them away, and keep everyone at arm's length. That this is a coping mechanism derived from trauma, and that trauma informs a certain kind of behavior. And it's so odd to see a very accurate depiction of these behavioral patterns in a mildly inappropriate DreamWorks movie.
I agree. I also really want to point out some of the other themes that come up in the film, like eugenics and... Eugenics in the sense that maybe that's a bit rough. Like racism and classism. Mm-hmm. Fiona's big struggle is that she feels she can't be a princess and an ogre, which is why she must marry Farquaad and have a true love's kiss. Mm-hmm. She cannot unite those two. She has been booted out of her...
far, far away.
Yeah, as a result of not fitting in. Shrek has experienced this marginalization and this trauma.
And interestingly enough, actual gentrification.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Something that hit me is that Lord Farquaad is a landlord, literally.
Who evicts the fairy tale creatures.
Who evicts a bunch of creatures and throws them into a swamp.
And he signed an eviction notice.
Yeah, why are the pigs German?
I don't know, but I thought I nailed that impression.
You did.
So, we are pigs. Pigs in the blanket, yeah? Yeah? Yeah. So, this is funny then, yeah? Yeah. This is funny, yeah. Yep, that's a good one.
But there is what I don't think I've fully processed this before. The way I interpreted Shrek as a kid was, Lord Farquaad just exiled them all. And they were exiled to Shrek's swamp. That is not what happens. They are all hiding from death.
Yeah,
there's a very small hint of this. I don't know if you know it. It circulated the internet recently, and the mama bear in the status quo. There's a scene where we're introduced to all these fairy tale creatures that are being like registered and put in cages.
Right, and then the baby bear is like, my cage is too small.
Yeah, and the mum and dad are in their cage, and the mama bear has a pink bow. Later, the baby bear and father bear are sat by a bonfire in Shrek's swamp crying.
Oh.
Later on in the film, there is a bear rug with a pink bow on it.
Oh, that's horrendous.
Mama bear was slaughtered. It's horrendous. And it's just like, okay, this is where maybe we were pushing the adult audience a little bit more. But also, yeah, so they only talk about being evicted. And obviously there's the torture scene with the gingerbread man, which is what tips us off to he needs to find them and get rid of them for good.
Yeah, I felt myself sort of confused by his motivations because... Yeah, I guess especially as an adult, you ask yourself, why is he evicting all of these fairy tale creatures? And obviously this is not a theme in the children's book at all. This is probably one of the main things that they introduce as Lord Farquaad, because all of the other characters and beasts in the movie are actually related to the book. But Lord Farquaad is a DreamWorks invention. And you see him use the fairy tale mirror, and you see him interrogate the gingerbread man.
No, not the buttons! Not my gumdrop button!
And what hit me was like, is he using fairy tale creatures to sort of achieve something? Like, is he looking for some kind of combination of fairy tale powers to help him achieve something, presumably becoming a king? But interesting, the mirror conversation goes really oddly because he begins to interrogate the mirror, and then the mirror diverts his attention by introducing him to the potential of a princess. But you never find out what he was originally going to ask the mirror about.
That wasn't to find out where the fairy tale creatures were? That's what I think I thought.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I think the first thing I thought was like, what was the red thread?
Yes. Yeah. That's fair. Yeah, it's, well, maybe that's because there was like a bigger plot that got cut out.
Okay.
Which I think works because apparently this was a plot to create a giant supermarket.
What?
I don't know the details of it. No one has elaborated so far. But I think they cut Lord Farquaad's motivations down, like boiled them down to the core issue, which is he evicts fairy tale creatures. He wants this perfect world of a gated community.
Yeah, you do see when Shrek and Donkey first come to Duloc, that a small detail that might easily not be noticed because it's a split second is that when they first enter, the city is all painted, but it's all newly painted. There's a building where the corner is still brown and not white, and a bunch of buckets of paint.
Oh, I didn't notice that. Yeah.
So Duloc has like recently been revamped or gentrified.
This is one of the things I really like about Shrek the movie, because it just cuts straight to oh, this is a world that's already in motion. This is a plot that's already in motion, which you rarely see in, like, children's villain stories. Like, you're always there in the beginning of the plot, and it works because that is not Shrek's journey. He doesn't actually care about these fairy tale creatures, as very explicitly expressed. Do not feel welcome. I'm going to make sure you guys leave the swamp.
Yeah, Shrek's motivations are solely based on his own needs.
Yeah, so you don't really need the whole, why is Lord Farquaad doing this? How did the world look like before? You catch up real quickly, which is why I think it works so well and why it's so engaging. And a lot of Shrek starts straight on the action. The status quo of it is that fairy tale creatures are being hunted. When Shrek and Donkey enter Duloc, there is already a tournament going on. You don't need the whole build up to the tournament. You sort of walk in right in the middle of this tournament of who's going to go rescue Fiona for me. And these are really good, tight storytelling things that I'm very excited about. Mm-hmm. It's surprising to me that it works so well and that it's such a tightly knit story because it was in production hell for years.
It does feel like it shouldn't work at all.
Yeah.
Even when you see the movie now, you're like, what? This shouldn't work.
So I would love to just write a mini-series about the production of Shrek because it should not have happened. And I'm just going to do a brief summation of some of the things that were just production hell about this film. I mean, you could write a book about it. People have. So it was produced from 1994 until its release in 2001. So 7 years. Originally, it was going to be motion capture, mixed with some live action bits.
Something that jumped out to me, actually, is how well the animation in Shrek has aged.
Yeah.
And this is going to be a weird note, but donkeys specifically always look really, really weird. Like, if you've ever seen those low-budget, like, knockoffs of Disney movies, the donkeys always are terrifying. And Donkey from Shrek doesn't give me nightmares.
Yeah, I mean, they were pretty much pushing the boundaries of animation as they were doing it. When they finally landed on just regular CG animation, there were so many glitches and there were so many issues because they didn't have the technology for the scope of this film yet. They didn't have the means for it, really. So they were writing the code as they were animating it, basically.
That's really interesting, because we so often, when we talk about animation progress, we tend to center that conversation on Pixar.
Right.
But honestly, I do think that DreamWorks does deserve some credit in terms of their accomplishments, because Shrek should not be watchable.
Right?
I'm sorry, but like an ogre and a donkey should not age well.
Fully.
It's from 2001.
Completely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just to circle back to some of one of the many reasons why this production should not have worked. As I already mentioned, that there are a lot of people credited for writing this script. They went through several writers, and the first version of Shrek, obviously live action and motion capture. If you imagine like the motion capture in Polar Express, and then
Yeah, Polar Express, which is unfortunately nightmare fuel.
Exactly.
Polar Express also being one of my favorite children's books.
Oh, fully. Yeah.
It's a movie I will
But it's
never
horrifying.
watch.
It's so scary.
So scary.
It's so scary.
CGI Tom Hanks is traumatizing.
Yeah. So imagine that mixed with like live action bits and some, it was, it prompted the following response from Katzenberg. It looked terrible. It didn't work. It wasn't funny, and I didn't like it. So he fired the entire team, including the writer at the time.
Oh, okay. I see now the many writing credits.
Yes, this writer was not credited. This was very early on, though. This writer was a young whippersnapper from New York called J.J. Abrams.
Oh my god.
Right? It's a saga. The production of this film is just many years of just really interesting.
Again, bringing it back to how the final product is so dissimilar from its inspiration.
Yeah. Imagine Shrek with just lens flare in every single frame.
That's like aggressively upsetting.
So they kept changing writers, they kept changing storyboarders and directors, and eventually they landed on like Andrew Adamson, who then later was joined by Vicky Johnson, and they somehow found a balance. But it was still not working that well. Like we talked before, like the animation was kind of glitchy and they couldn't really keep up. It was so like the black sheep of DreamWorks at the time. So while Shrek was going on, they were doing The Prince of Egypt and Spirit. The horse movie. If you didn't do well on The Prince of Egypt, you would be sent to work on Shrek. And they would call it being Shreked.
Okay.
So Shrek was production jail for people that didn't please Katzenberg.
Production jail.
Yes. The final leg of like... So the final straw and what felt like was going to really break the production finally was that, unfortunately, the original voice of Shrek was Chris Farley, who recorded like 90% of the dialogue and then unfortunately passed away. And at this point, the director, Andrew Adamson, begged to be fired. He just really he didn't have it in him to quit, and he just begged Katzenberg to fire him. And he refused and kept on. And then Mike Myers was brought on and he did the Scottish accent. And my interpretation is that the momentum kind of took off when they pitched two things that went well as jokes and basically were given the green light to make Shrek full on a comedy. I think that's the final turning point in how Shrek came to be what it is today. There was a storyboarder who pitched the gingerbread man torture scene, and he ended up doing the gingerbread man voice because they couldn't find anyone doing it to do it as funny as he did. And there was the opening sequence, which I also really love, which is Shrek reading this gorgeous fairy tale and then basically calling it bullshit and using a page to wipe his ass. And it's that those two somehow, I think, were, after that, they were told, right, we're just going to do it a comedy fully, which is why I think it doesn't take itself seriously at all, and yet it's really good quality and takes its audience very seriously. And I think it might have been because there was very little pressure for it to work, because no one expected it to work.
Which begs the question of, like, why all of the very expensive music and very expensive professional actors rather than voice actors?
Yeah. Well, I think DreamWorks had that model kind of... Wait, where did that start? I think that did...
I'm pretty sure Shrek is the first one that started that trend, that the sort of DreamWorks trademark. The DreamWorks trademark of having iconic, especially American music, and having famous actors do the voice work.
Well, the soundtrack is interesting because some of the songs I think are really well picked, like Rufus Wainwright, and, you know, those are kind of quiet, nice, atmospheric pop songs. All Star wasn't supposed to be in it, which
the breakout
is amazing.
Star of Shrek. All Star wasn't supposed to be in Shrek.
Nope, it was a placeholder, and then the test audience apparently really liked it, and that is how they landed on it, which is just, like, imagine Shrek without All-Star.
I kind of don't want to.
No.
It's hard, especially given the memification of Shrek and presumably the elongating of that career via Shrek.
Yeah, exactly. To sum up, the production of it went through years and years of different versions, and what I think is interesting is how much of the book is surprising, because it's a whole other story than the book. Yeah. But then again, it feels like an expansion on the book rather than, they just took elements from it and were inspired and did something like it. Because Donkey still has the meaning of being like the opposite of this noble steed. You have those elements. There's an ugly princess whom Shrek deems beautiful, and a number of other things that I think are surprising, like there's still the dragon. I think it's surprising how much of it has remained in the film. Yeah,
I think that's something that stood out to me, is how much of the book managed to still be in the movie despite the movie being nothing like the book.
Yeah.
But that being said, though, like, the book only contains that many things.
Let's talk a little bit about the subversion of fairy tales, because you had a really good point. To read Shrek, you sort of need a repertoire of these tropes that you've internalized. And Shrek the movie, I think, very organically transfers that element of the story onto film by responding to a lot of Disney tropes, some of which is significantly more mean-spirited than is necessary.
It is quite a mean-spirited movie.
This relates back to Katzenberg being fired by Michael Eisner. 2 fun facts. If you look up a photo of Michael Eisner and compare it to Lord Farquaad, they look fairly similar. And if you kind of squint, the name Farquaad can be interpreted as Wad.
Again, bringing back the question of, is this appropriate for children?
Right? And it feels like some of those jokes feel very displaced, because one thing is these organic kind of fairy tale creatures, because they don't feel like Disney fairy tale creatures. They feel like they were taking out the storybooks, you know?
Yeah, they do feel, I mean, given what I'm going to presume to be relatively standard knowledge, European fairy tales are quite grim.
Yeah.
They're very grim dark. They're teaching children very hard lessons about life, and they are not interested in pussyfooting around violent topics. And Disneyfication of fairy tales is a whole other conversation, but DreamWorks in this case certainly aren't shying away from presenting fairy tales as harsh and scary, which is what they are.
Yeah. I do like some of the Disney World jokes that are portrayed in Duloc. The animatronic Welcome to Duloc song that very much relates to It's a Small World After All. Like, they're very similar. I think it's really funny.
Reminds me, so in Shrek, the children's book, there are a number of rhymes or limericks that follow the same rhythm or that follow the same rhyme or melody. For example, when Shrek meets the witch, she is crooning to herself, "This is the way I cook my bats, stir my bats, taste my bats, season my bats in the morning, stew and brew and chew my bats, diddle and fiddle and feddle my bats early in the morning." So there is this recurring theme of making fun of recognizable nursery rhymes.
Yeah.
And apparently also It's a Small World After All.
That's a really good point, actually. That's really interesting. So Shrek the movie often, when I went through different articles about it, a lot of people will refer to it as a direct critique of Disney, which I don't think it is. I think it is more related to the book's initial intent of let's subvert fairy tale expectations. There are stabs at Disney, like The Small World After All or Michael Eisner. The one thing that I think the film kind of directly responds to with Disney, which is a fairy tale trope that Disney has also very much cemented, is appearance being, if you're beautiful, you're good. And specifically with princesses and women, they are always beautiful. And especially 90s Disney princess tropes, which is a whole other... White. Yeah. You know, you would have stories like Hunchback of Notre Dame or Beauty and the Beast, but that would be the men. So Shrek, I feel, is the only film still for kids with a really texturally ugly princess. That is surprising to me that hasn't carried on more, and I think that's why it's still a very strong film.
I think something that I actually did find disappointing, coming from the perspective of having read the book and thinking about book to movie specifically, was that in the book, the princess simply is ugly. She's ugly from start to finish. Yeah. It's not a curse. It's not something that needs solving. It's not something that lowers her life quality. She is ugly, and that's who she is. And that's a good thing. And I was kind of sad, even though it does end up subverting itself, I did find myself a bit sad that Fiona wasn't just ugly to begin with.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are complicated conversations about depicting ugliness as something specific, given how that often is ableist or racist. But I mean, like, making her green would have worked. No one's green. Nothing makes you green. So I did find myself a little sad that she starts out, you know, a bombshell. Cameron Diaz.
Yeah.
I was thinking, what would have happened if she had been ugly the whole time?
Yeah.
what would that story be?
It would definitely have been a very different story, but could have had, just like a whole other comedic element to it as well.
Yeah,
because I see what you mean. If Shrek fell in love with someone who was actually also ugly.
Yeah, because I do think they really both talk about appearance and self-worth, but they do have fundamentally different points.
And this is why I think the film is a direct response to Disney specifically, because they always have these, not always, but a lot of Disney films and other animated films from the 90s, like The Swan Princess, will have this transformation element where the happy ending is, oh, you end up beautiful. So I think that the whole taking that transformation trope and arguing against that was quite strong.
It's quite intentional.
When it came out, yeah.
Yes, that it was written with the intention that Fiona would subvert a Disney trope.
Exactly.
That is a good point.
I do think the film undoes some of the point it's making in making a lot of short jokes about Lord Farquaad. And this is, again, one of those things where it stands out as, like, the mean streak of direct stabs at Disney that are less about the fairy tale tropes and more about Katzenberg is mad at Eisner.
Yeah.
Apparently, Mike Eisner, he's, like, over 6 foot and has often referred to Katzenberg as short.
Okay.
And specifically as a slur for little people. So to depict the Michael Eisner character as a little person, I thought was undoing a lot of the point that Shrek was making.
Yeah, I also think, and to circle back to the point about Shrek being a little inappropriate at times. I know that talking about what is or isn't appropriate for children is like an incredibly hot topic.
Yeah.
But it is a topic worth talking about given that children's media is speaking directly to them. The two things that jumped out at me were the constant jokes about ass.
I didn't pick up on these as much as you did.
So the two ways they made these jokes was either to talk about donkey as an ass as much as possible to circumvent American censorship laws, which happens twice. And then jokes where they either cut off the sentence or sort of nod to the audience at a place where you would naturally think ass. So you would finish the sentence with ass, or you would infer that they are referring explicitly to, and I mean explicitly the word ass. So someone in that writing room just really likes to say ass.
Yeah.
And then also jokes about Lord Farquaad's, height and his appearance, but also about his penis.
Yeah.
Jokes about whether or not he's compensating, jokes about, his sexual prowess, and jokes that are putting down certain body types and certain genitals. Yeah. And I thought, not only is this sort of recreating some pretty unpleasant attitudes, it's also it just doesn't have a place in children's media. No. Not because children can't talk about genitals or butts, but because the way these things are being spoken about are explicitly adult and explicitly cruel.
Side note, as a kid, I was very confused about Lord Farquaad as a little person because one of the fairy tale creatures, or some of the fairy tale creatures that are exiled, are from the cast of Snow White. And as a kid, I couldn't really figure out what was this about and why wasn't he considered a fairy tale creature in this world.
Because he's just so damn short.
Yeah. And so it also just doesn't work with the text of...
Yeah, it kind of undermining their own point.
Yeah. Which is they made a point out of him being insecure because if he had a similar...
if he really was compensating.
Yeah.
Which is left up to the audience to decide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If he had a similar sort of issue with himself, quite similar to Fiona and Shrek, feeling excluded from society by looking different, maybe that would...
Yeah, which is something that the book manages to avoid because the book isn't complicating Shrek and Fiona's...
No.
Sorry, the princess. She is unnamed.
She is unnamed.
Shrek and the princess's ugliness. They just are ugly.
Yeah.
And they love it.
Yeah.
And obviously a movie can rarely be so uncomplicated. But there is something to be said about presenting this without adding on a bunch of trauma and personality connections. There's something to be said about just being ugly and proud.
Yeah.
And liking it.
Yeah, I mean, as we've sort of talked about this, and as I was watching the film, I did catch myself thinking a lot about, would it work as a 90-minute movie to have a character be confident in who they are and never change? And there is, or sort of the journey being, they were right to begin with. And I can't think of any except Pirates of the Caribbean and Jack Sparrow.
Interesting. You are right. He was right to begin with.
Yes. He's always been right. He's always done the right thing, even though he hasn't. But he doesn't change at all. Anyway, he gets his ship. He doesn't learn. He just, and I know there are probably other films. I just can't think of any. Yeah.
Maybe, but that begs the question of, like, does film narrative and writing and film's attitude toward characters, does that need to become more diverse? Like, do we need to think outside of the pretty constricted box around film writing? Like, can we write movies where the characters were right to begin with, and where the characters are unspecified ogres that love that they're ugly? Is that an option?
Yeah, I think you can. I think what that boils down to is... another one is Alice in Wonderland. Who doesn't really go through anything specifically. She does. She wants to be in it. She goes. She kind of wanders around, and her big emotional trope is, or her big emotional development is, she wants to go home. She doesn't want to be in this fairy tale world anymore. But what makes Alice in Wonderland entertaining is not that we are that emotionally invested in her development as a character. We are fascinated by the world that she's in. So I think if you are going to make a film like that work, it depends on what the surrounding characters are.
Right. Is the main character just sort of a vehicle for the audience to sit on their shoulders and follow along?
Mad Max is an interesting example, now that I think about it.
Yeah.
Because that is exactly the function he has.
Yeah, he's just kind of there to hold the camera.
Yeah. There are other characters more interesting than him going on, but yeah, those examples I can think of have worlds around them that are more engaging, which is interesting. I'm sure once we finish recording, I'm going to go home and I'm going to be like, oh my god, this movie does it perfectly. But yeah, I think, especially in the kids' film, that would have been interesting because Shrek still follows other story tropes that sit in our bodies as like what we're used to seeing. Like, there is a happy ending, there is a villain that gets defeated, there is, oh, Shrek's terrible, but there's someone worse than him, and actually he's not terrible. And I think...
Right, Shrek is a solid guy, despite his prickly exterior.
Yeah.
Whereas Shrek in the children's book, presumably, is just a big meanie.
Being mean.
Yeah, enjoys who he is, enjoys scaring people, enjoys burping fire, enjoys his ugly wife.
Yeah. There's no protagonist qualities. But yeah, it's interesting, the whole question of what would Shrek look like without an emotional core, because it does follow movie structure, turning points that very strongly relate to the character's evolution. Like we talked about, Shrek is very much a movie about letting people in. And I would say a very interesting point is that it follows rom-com tropes, very like by the book, which is also why Shrek feels kind of weirdly paced, I think, because you get the midpoint where most midpoints hit, which is he saves the princess. That's the first trial of the character. And then you get a very, very, very long fifth sequence of the film, which is the relationships sequence, where there are all these subplots going on, and that is where you might see more of a lovers sequence evolve.
The sort of reasoning of why they even like each other.
Yeah, which is significantly longer than these sequences usually are, because you both have the montage of them. You have Fiona overhearing Shrek talking to Donkey about his trauma. You have the two of them defeating Robin Hood and his merry men, which I also really want to talk about. And you have their last evening together. They postpone, they don't want to deliver Fiona just yet. She was in a rush to get there, now she's definitely not. They're like, Donkey, let's gaslight him into thinking he's ill and we can stay another night. And basically, that means that the third act of the film, because post that, you get the crisis sequence, which is the very obvious, like, there's a rom-com misunderstanding, and now they're miserable, but they hate each other, and then Donkey kind of pushes Shrek into the third act. And the third act is so short, it's like 5 minutes. And I think the reason it's so short is because they needed more room to develop Shrek and Fiona, because she doesn't come in until the midpoint.
Yeah, it has a very, very long sort of setting up. And that, to me, when I was watching, struck me as taking a long time in terms of establishing Shrek as this loner in his his swamp. Yeah, so establishing takes a long time because they're establishing that Shrek lives alone in his swamp. They're establishing that the fairy tale characters are being kicked out of their homes. They're establishing that Shrek doesn't want them in his home. They're establishing Lord Farquaad and Duloc. They're establishing Donkey.
Yeah.
And then finally, after all of this has been set up, you go to Fiona and some of the more like action-packed, quickly paced sequences begin entering the movie, but up until that point, things have actually been really slow, and it's a lot of information to take in.
Yeah,
and I think that's something that stood out to me. Is like, oh, this movie is kind of slow at times. I felt myself sort of slipping attention span wise.
I felt the opposite, but I think maybe it's because I was watching it for the first time with like screenwriter eyes, and I was like, oh my god, I could never. This is so good. And there is a little bit of action in like Shrek defeats all the knights to like...
Yeah, that's a really fun sequence.
Yeah, oh my god.
I always think that when it was about to happen, I was like, oh, the knight fight is going to happen. Oh, I love this part.
Use the chair! It's so funny.
It is. That's really fun.
Old women in this... Oh my god, can we just talk about the old women in this?
Sure.
The old woman who tries to sell Donkey. The funniest scene. I was so excited about it. I was like, I forgot. This is so good. And then the old woman who gives Shrek a chair to beat the knight with. And it's just like, who decided that old women were badass and who decided that they should be like... Why are there so many...
subverting tropes.
Yeah, right.
Again, subverting that Disneyfication of old women. Yeah. Where they're always sweet and nice. Whereas like old women in European fairy tales are genuinely basically harbingers of disaster. Like, they will your life up.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, but like that's a fun thing, right? Like they're subverting a Disney trope, but they're actually using a pretty classic trope, like the old woman trying to get rid of the donkey. Classic. I don't know if old women being WWE fans is like a classic, but this does occur.
I think the way she tries to get rid of Donkey is what really got me. Like, he obviously is going to pretend he doesn't talk.
Yeah.
And she tries to ventriloquist him. It's just like the desperation to get rid of this really annoying donkey.
He is really annoying.
Yes.
That did hit me pretty hard when I was like, wow, Donkey really is super annoying. Ugh. What is it with American children's film and always having characters that are genuinely annoying?
It's interesting because I felt like in terms of the long setup, at first my initial thought was maybe the inciting incident is more related to Donkey arriving. It's certainly one turning point that's significant in terms of destroying Shrek's status quo. And it sort of hit me as like, oh, this would be, if this was just about Shrek and Donkey going on an adventure and then becoming roommates, this would be the beginning of a buddy cop film. You have a partner you don't want.
Which is interesting, also something that Eddie Murphy has done a bunch of times.
Yeah, exactly, which is, yeah. And then, yeah, so Shrek subverts a lot of fairy tale and Disney tropes, but it follows some other tropes in films, like a lot of rom-com tropes, ruining a wet, like running in and like interrupting a wedding.
Oh yeah. Objecting.
That's not a fairy tale thing.
Not at all. That's like a Cameron Diaz, Jennifer Lopez trope.
Yeah. Graduate. Like, what is it? And so that's kind of interesting in that it can still feel formulaic that way, even though they also try and subvert that with Donkey being like, oh no, you can't go in yet, you have to wait until they say I do, and then they miss the point. It's like, he already said it. Like,
yeah, that's a question. I think that Shrek also turns to the fourth wall a lot. It's very it's very direct in its subversion. Like, it's not trying to be subversively subversive. It's just saying, here we are rejecting these tropes or turning them on their head and winking constantly to the audience. And to bring it back to the earlier point about child appropriateness, while children do understand subversions and do have an idea of narrative expectations, I do think that the audience this movie is winking to is not the children, it is the presumed parents. Yeah. And I did find myself thinking that was kind of unfortunate, because I don't think that it's taking its child audience that seriously. No. It does seem to actually be talking to adults more. And I think that's kind of unfair in a children's movie. Yeah.
It relates back to the original sort of statement by the director of, like, this is a film for us that we then adjusted to children. And I do think there is a positive aspect to that, which is it also trusted its audience more to cope with some of the more, let's say, the darker elements of it. I think children probably won't be excited about the subversion of a rom-com wedding scene, but maybe Shrek scaring away the villagers, remaining cool and talking to them about, oh, you know what, you're thinking of giants, ogres, we squeeze your jelly from your eyes and that's great on toast. Like, that's more what I think is exciting for children.
Like the gross out factor. And I think it does appeal to kids.
Yeah, and I think that wouldn't have happened. Or the fart jokes.
The many fart jokes.
The many fart jokes. I don't think that does happen that much in other films that aren't Shrek.
Interesting, because I think that gross out factor, especially in terms of American children's media, gross out factor is like a go-to to appeal to kids. And Shrek doesn't do this, but in general, I do think that it's so overused and that it oftentimes is kind of dumbing it down. Yeah. That, like, oh, we'll just do something gross, and kids like gross things, right? Like, snot, poopy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the gross out factor, now that you talk about it, obviously, that's very true. But I do think the other element of, like Shrek scaring the villagers, more specifically, in how he does it. And then at the end of his whole spiel of, these are all the things I'm going to do to you, he's like, this is the part where you run away. Like, those are elements of subverting expectations that I think kids do pick up on, and I think that is a very exciting part of it. Especially, oh my god, Fiona is hilarious. She is so funny. I forgot how great this was, because kids definitely know the Princess in the Tower and being kissed and woken and whatnot. And her whole, like, oh great, okay, he's here, I'm gonna get ready. And then he shakes her awake, and then furthermore she's trying to, like, debate, like, please, can we do something? Can
we follow the story like it's supposed to go?
Recite me a poem, a limerick, like, just something.
It is an entertainingly, like, metatextual way of talking about the tropes, and that, like, the characters within the story are themselves aware of the tropes and are constantly verbally confronting them directly. And that, I think, is definitely something that children will respond positively to and find funny, because children are intelligent and they do understand these things. And I do think that adults oftentimes speak way too indirectly to kids. Yeah. And they'll probably get a kick out of that kind of thing. So in that way, I do think they do a good job of speaking to their child audience.
Exactly. And I think that is sort of related to how the production of it was eventually landed on being more of a comedy.
I think something that I actually was a bit disappointed about was that while Shrek is a really funny movie and it stands on its own, especially given that no one remembers that it's a children's book, is that there is no way for Shrek the children's book to ever become something else. Shrek the movie has, like, totally surpassed any kind of cultural recognition and is incredibly ubiquitous. And while it's a good movie and it does borrow a lot from the book, I did find myself thinking, oh, that's kind of a bummer, though, because the book is genuinely something else and is a little bit better at addressing its child audience. And I thought, oh, it's such a bummer that this will never get adapted again as something closer to itself, as something more like the book, especially given that they have the same name. interestingly enough, there is an audiobook read by Stanley Tucci.
Really?
Yeah, this is an interesting choice. But yeah, I was a bit disappointed thinking like, oh, okay, Shrek is a great movie and it's fun, but as far as adaptations go, it doesn't have that much to do with the point of the children's book.
No.
And it has surpassed it in the cultural conscious. And so that sort of means that Shrek by William Steig will never become another children's media. I was a bit like, oh, that sort of bums me out. Though I do think they are in conversation with one another. Like, I do think that they are talking about similar topics.
Yeah.
And that Shrek the movie made an effort to include and expand upon elements in the book.
Yeah, I definitely think Shrek elaborates on the themes of the book in terms of, you know, ugliness equals bad. Pretty equals good. And then making it more complicated than that, or then going into the complexities of that, of being perceived as ugly, or how these tropes exist in children's movies. I think the movie certainly, I think there's a reason why the movie kind of feels like an expansion of the book in terms of themes and these elements that we kind of recognize. And I think that's because it resonated. The book definitely wasn't just, oh, someone brought it to someone's attention, let's buy up the characters and make a whole new plate of whatever we want and whatever our test audience says makes us money. Like, it was like the producer, John H. Williams, read this with his children and thought it was hilarious.
Yeah, there's certainly a certain amount of love for the content of Shrek by William Steig.
And Steven Spielberg bought it 4 years before, and for the same reason, and had all sorts of ideas of, oh, let's do it with Bill Murray and Steve Martin. And yeah, like you say, there is this like positive response from these adults that wanted to turn it into a movie, and it came from, I feel, less of an exploitive place and more of a love for the original work, which is interesting.
Which is really nice. It is really nice to see a book being adapted. I think this happens quite a bit with children's books, especially. Someone reads this book with their children, and their children love it, and they're like, oh, we gotta make this into a movie. And that tends to be a pretty positive place to start from.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I do think it was fun.
Yeah, but it's interesting, the whole aspect of, Shrek the movie overtaking William Steig's novel.
Yeah. His little brainchild.
His little brainchild. Especially because the illustrations are so their own thing.
They're so fun, and they would make a great children's cartoon.
Yeah. But the green skin and the ears are so similar to the DreamWorks Shrek that it would just feel like off-brand Shrek in many ways. Yeah,
like DreamWorks did lift the character design directly, and that's not a bad thing. And I think it's, I don't know if I would say rare. I think there are a couple other examples of a movie adaptation overtaking the book, but just not to this extent. This is sort of a rare bird, because Shrek the movie is like $1 billion internet like IP at this point, whereas Shrek the book is sort of an oddity. Yeah.
Like, most people do not know that it's based on a book, and I mean, they did credit William Steig, or dedicate Shrek 2 to him at the end of the credits, or at the end credits of Shrek 2. There is a dedication to William Steig, who unfortunately had passed away at that point.
It does beg the question, though, like, who looks at the end credits, Moina?
I do. I look at the end credits.
Yeah, you and Marvel fans.
I want to know who wrote this, who directed it, who produced it. Yeah.
I think, like, in conclusion, that, like, this is a surprisingly respectful and direct adaptation, and that they get more of the book into the movie than you would initially expect.
Exactly. Yeah, I fully agree.
A fun, unusual romp, and no one could have predicted the green ketchup.
If you want to read next month's novel, or receive updates on future episodes, you can follow us at novel_film on Instagram. You can find past episodes on wrir.org in the archives. For business inquiries, you may reach us at novelfilmpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to Novel Film, hosted by Bridie Baker and Moina Soderstrand, and produced by Melissa Vaughn for WRIR.